Hello there, everyone. This is your girl, Lady D. Hope you guys are having an awesome Thursday so far. I decided to come on. Already informed you guys that R. Kelly and Joycelyn, I believe that's the correct pronunciation, are engaged. And we learned that from Jennifer's objection to the pre-sentence report. And so I was lucky enough to get a copy of that motion. So I decided to come on and I'll just read it. And you guys, we could discuss it tomorrow at our jam session. Yes, we still doing our jam session, R. Kelly jam session, 7 p.m. Central, tomorrow though. So I figured I'll do this now, and we can talk about it during our jam session. So let me read it. It's the defendant Robert Kelly's objections to the pre-sentence report. Defendant Robert S. Kelly, by and through his counsel, Jennifer Bonjean of the Bonjean Law Group, lodges the following objections to the pre-sentence report. Hereinafter, they saying PSR. So that's so if I say PSR, they talking about the pre-sentence report. Pursuant to Federal Rule Criminal, I want to say paragraph 32F. That's what I want to say. It's Fed R Crim P 32F. So I want to say that's what they're making reference to. So this is the introduction. After a jury trial, defendant was convicted of racketeering and 8 freestanding Mann Act violations. There are duplicative to charged racketeering acts. The charges stem from the allegations of 5 separate women: Stephanie, Jane, Jerwanda, Sonia, and Faith. Defendant has filed an extensive motion for a judgment of acquittal pursuant to Federal Rule Crim P29, a motion for a new trial, and a supplemental motion for a new trial pursuant to Federal Rule Criminal Paragraph 33. Defendant reserves the right to file a sentencing memorandum prior to his sentencing hearing. Objections to pre-sentence report. Generally, defendant objects to probation's narrative set forth in the offense portion of the report for the reasons set forth in defendant's Rule 29 motion. Separately, defendant makes the following objections. Part A, the offense. Charges and convictions. Paragraph 11. Defendant objects to the government's assertion that it could prove by a preponderance of the evidence the defendant's commission of racketeering acts 3 and 4. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty on those racketeering acts, evincing that it did not believe testimony from Sonia. There is no reason to believe that the jury would have credited Sonia's testimony under the lesser standard of proof. The offense conduct, paragraph 15. Defendant objects to the use of enterprise member to describe an employee who ran errands such as picking up defendant's prescriptions. Paragraph 16 through 17. Defendant objects to the PSR's conclusion that an enterprise existed. As set forth in detail in defendant's Rule 29 motion, the government failed to prove the existence of a group of individuals associated in fact for the common purpose of carrying out a fraudulent or illegal scheme. None of the so-called enterprise members identified in the PSR, otherwise known as defendant's inner circle, that's in quotes, provided any testimony suggesting that they facilitated defendant in carrying out unlawful sexual conduct. At best, Demetrius Smith admitted to assisting defendant's marriage to Aaliyah, but did not admit to having knowledge of a sexual relationship between the two, and did not admit to facilitating an illegal scheme. The probation department has done nothing more than identify individuals who worked for defendant. Paragraphs 17 through 18. Defendant objects to the assertion that anyone in defendant's, quote, inner circle, end quote, escorted minors to rooms within defendant's residence or studio to the extent it suggests that any employees of defendant had knowledge of his visitors' ages. Defendant objects to the claim that defendant's employees handed out defendant's phone number to minors. These people are just awful. No testimony established that any employees recruited minors for the defendant. Defendant further objects to the claim that defendant's employees solicited minors to join defendant backstage for after parties. There is simply no evidence that anyone recruited minors specifically to attend any after parties. While it is true that defendants who attended defendant's concert were sometimes invited backstage to meet defendant, after parties or backstage gatherings are simply a routine aspect of the music industry. Defendant objects to probation's continued use of the word inner circle, quote, end quote, a term coined by the government that merely describes individuals who work for the defendant and cannot be let me repeat that. Let me go back. Defendant objects to probation's continued use of the word, quote, inner circle, end quote, a term coined by the government that merely describes individuals who work for the defendant and cannot be said to have knowledge about the age of any of the women with whom defendant had relationships. Paragraph 19. Defendant objects to the characterization of signing non-disclosure agreements as a rule of the enterprise. Use of NDAs are routine for high-profile individuals. Indeed, most celebrities require the signing of NDAs to work for them or even step foot into their orbit. This was not a rule of any enterprise. Defendant further objects to the contention that defendant's rules of his business and home were rules of the enterprise. Defendant's general rule that prohibited guests from wandering his home unattended was simply a rule of his business and home. Seriously. Paragraph 20. Defendant objects to the report suggesting that wage disputes between the defendant and his employees was a feature of the so-called enterprise. Defendant docked the pay of his employees from time to time for various reasons. Those employees objected. This reflected typical employment disputes unrelated to any charged conduct. Defendant objects to the assertion that he required his employees to write letters falsely confessing to bad conduct. No such evidence established that defendant required his employees to write such letters so he could use them for his protection. Exactly, that's stupid. Paragraph 22. Defendant objects to the assertion that member of the enterprise aided and abetted and conspired to commit certain crimes. There is no evidence that any defendant's employees knowingly aided and abetted sexual activity with minors, sexual activity without disclosing a sexual transmitted disease, child pornography, extortion, coercion, or blackmail. Paragraph 28. that pre-sentence report is something else. That's why, like I said yesterday, why the government didn't have any objection. Paragraph 28. Defendant had no role in the title of Aaliyah's first album, Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, as suggested by the government. Aaliyah herself has publicly explained many times that the title of her album sprung from a desire to be taken seriously in the music industry, and that it was a decision ultimately made by her managers and the record label, not R. Kelly. That's not in there, but I'm just saying. The conduct against Jane Doe, number 1. Paragraph 29. Defendant objects to the unsupported assertion that defendant began sexual abusing Aaliyah in 1992 or 1993. Apart from the isolated incident that Jane Doe 7 claims to have witnessed between defendant and Aaliyah, the record is devoid of evidence of ongoing sexual abuse. Count 1, Racketeering Act 1, bribery. Paragraphs 32-33. Defendant objects to the assertion that Smith told defendant that he could obtain a fake identification card for Aaliyah by bribing an employee at the public aid office. Smith testified that he did not recall discussing this with the defendant. Paragraphs 53 through 55. Defendant objects to the allegations Ruggiero conduct. I'm not sure what that means, if she's making reference to Ruggiero conduct. That's something I need to look up. The jury rejected Sonia's testimony. The record does not suggest that the jury would have credited Sonia's testimony under a preponderance of evidence standard. Offense level computation. Count 1, Racketeering Act, bribery. Paragraph 129. Defendant objects to the enhancement for the role in the offense where there is no evidence defendant attempted to use a person less than 18 years of age to commit the offense of bribery. Wow. These folks are something else. The record is devoid of evidence that Aaliyah had knowledge that a bribery occurred or that she played any role in the bribery, even if the bribery involved obtaining an identification card for her. Paragraph 130. The government's evidence failed to show that defendant was even aware that a bribe had taken place, let alone that he was the organizer or lender of the bribe. Even if defendant was the beneficiary of the bribe, the government did not establish he was the lender of this specific criminal activity. Count 1, Racketeering Act 2, sexual exploitation of a child, Jane Doe 2. Paragraph 134. Defendant objects to the 2-point enhancement where the commission of a sexual act is duplicative to the underlying offense of sexual exploitation of a child. Paragraph 136. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement of the basis that the evidence does not reveal the defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 2. Ruggiero conduct. Again, I have to see what that means. Count Racketeering Act 3, kidnapping. Can you believe these charges? Jane Doe 3, paragraph 139. Defendant objects to the consideration of a so-called Ruggiero conduct. Although the government contends that it can prove the allegations involving Jane Doe 3, which is Sonia, by a preponderance of the evidence was presented to the jury and was rejected by the jury, presumably because the jury did not credit Sonia's testimony. There is nothing in this record that suggests that Sonia's testimony should be credited under the lower standard of proof. Oh my God. Paragraph 143. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement of the basis that the evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 4 or 5 participants in connection with the Racketeering Act 3. Ruggiero conduct, count Racketeering Act 4, Mann Act, Jane Doe 3. Paragraph 146. Defendant objects to the consideration of so-called Ruggiero, oh my God, excuse me guys, conduct. Although the government contends that it can prove the allegations involving Jane Doe 3, which is Sonia, she was, okay, whatever, we'll discuss this tomorrow. The evidence was presented to the jury and was rejected by the jury, presumably because the jury did not credit Sonia's testimony. There is nothing in this record that suggests that Sonia's testimony should be credited under the lower standard of proof. Wow, she just said that. Paragraph. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement of the basis that the evidence does not reveal that the defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with the Racketeering Act 3. County 1 Racketeering Act 5. I wonder if she meant to say count 1. I think that's a typo. But count 1 Racketeering Act 5, Mann Act, Jane Doe 4. Jane Doe 4. Paragraph 154. Defendant objects to an enhancement for unduly influencing a minor to engage in prohibited sexual conduct. As this conduct is duplicative to the elements of Racketeering Act 5 as charged. Paragraph 155. Defendant objects to an enhancement for use of a computer or cell phone to induce the travel of a minor to engage in prohibited sexual conduct. There is no evidence that Jane Doe 4, which is Geronda, traveled anywhere. At best, she took the train to defendant's home and was given a ride from the train station. Furthermore, there is no evidence that defendant enticed or induced Jane Doe 4, to come to his house to engage in sexual conduct. The government offered no text communication between defendant and Jane Doe 4, and she did not testify to any specific communications from the defendant that reflect persuasion, induced, or coercion. Wow. Those people are something else. Paragraph 156. Defendant objects to an enhancement based on the commission of a sex act where the sex act is already taken into account in the Mann Act violation itself. The enhancement is duplicative. These people are something else. Paragraph 158. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 4 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 5. Count 1 Racketeering Act 6. Forced labor, Jane Doe 4. Paragraph 162. Defendant objects to probation's contention that another felony offense was committed during the commission of Racketeering Act 6, specifically sexual exploitation of a child pursuant to Section 2251 sub A. Paragraph 164. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement of the basis that the evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 6. Count 1 Racketeering Act 7, sexual exploitation of a child, Jane Doe 4. Paragraph 168. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the offense involved the commission of a sexual act by use of physical force. There is no evidence that physical force was used in connection with this racketeering act. This racketeering act involves the claim that defendant video recorded Jane Doe 4, which is Jerwanda, during sex acts. This record is devoid of any suggestion that any recording of sex acts with Jerwanda involved use of physical force. I thought he never touched that woman. I'm confused again with this case. Paragraph 169. Defendant objects to an enhancement for use of a computer or cell phone to induce the travel of a minor to engage in prohibited sexual conduct. There is evidence that Jane Doe 4 Jerwanda traveled. No, let me go back. There is no evidence that Jane Doe 4 Jerwanda traveled anywhere. At best, she took the train to defendant's home and was given a ride from the train station. Furthermore, there is no evidence that defendant enticed or induced Jane Doe 4 to come to his house to engage in sexual conduct. The government offered no text communication between defendant and Jane Doe 4, and she did not testify to any specific communications from the defendant that reflects persuasion, inducement, or coercion. Wow, the government they kept using the same, but just trying to reword it, because she's basically saying the same thing over. But that's my opinion. Paragraph 171. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved or more participant. Let me repeat that. Paragraph 171. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 7. Count 1, Racketeering Act 8, Mann Act, Jane Doe 5. Paragraph 175. Defendant objects to any enhancement on the basis that defendant unduly influenced a minor to engage in prohibited sexual conduct. As the government conceded, Jane Doe 5, Jane, falsely told defendant she was 18 of age. Furthermore, with the facilitation of her mother, Jane induced defendant into sexual relationship, not the other way around. You go, Jennifer. GX233A, she's making some reference to something. Furthermore, this enhancement is unjustified where undue influence is an element of Racketeering Act 8B, the number 8B, namely a Mann Act violation based on coercion or enticement. The enhancement is, once again, is duplicative to punishment incorporated into the base offense level. Paragraph 176. Defendant objects to an enhancement for use of a computer or cell phone to induce the travel of a minor to engage in prohibited sexual conduct. There is no evidence that defendant induced or persuaded Jane to travel to California. And there is no evidence that there was a computer or cell phone used to induce the travel. Jane was living with the defendant in Illinois, where the age of consent was 17. Jane was 17 of age. Jane traveled with defendant because they were in a relationship, not because defendant had to induce her to travel to engage in prohibited sex activities. Paragraph 176. Defendant objects to the contention that he used a cell phone to persuade, entice, coerce, or facilitate the travel of a minor, as discussed supra, and as conceded by the government. Defendant had no knowledge that Jane was a minor at the time of this underlying offense, where Jane lied to defendant about her age. Furthermore, the text exchange showed that it was Jane with her mother that were doing the enticing, not the other way around. Okay, tell him, Jennifer. Paragraph 177. Defendant objects to any enhancement for an offense involving the commission of a sex act or sexual contact where such conduct is duplicative to the charged offense and already contemplated by the base level offense. Paragraph 179. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the evidence does not reveal the defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 8. Count 1, Racketeering Act 10, sexual exploitation of a child, Jane Doe 5. Paragraph 183. Defendant objects to the 2-point enhancement where the commission of a sexual act is duplicative to the underlying offense of sexual exploitation of a child. Paragraph 184. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the offense involved material that portray sadistic or sadistic or I don't know. Oh, shucks. I hate that. Sadistic or I don't know. Let me spell it. It's sadistic. I can't pronounce it for some reason. I don't know. Sadistic, or I'm going to spell it MASOCHISTIC. Again, the word I'm trying to pronounce is MASOCHISTIS. I don't know. Dang, I'm sorry, guys. Conduct or otherwise depictions of violence. The government did not offer any videos into evidence that portrayed Jane's sex acts with the defendant in California. There is no evidence whatsoever that the videos allegedly created in California during the relevant time period involved sadistic or masochistic, something like that, conduct, or any depictions of violence, including alleged chastisements. Let me read that one over. There is no evidence whatsoever that the videos created in California during the relevant time period involved sadistic or masochistic conduct or any depictions of violence involving alleged chastisements. Paragraph 185. Defendant objects to any enhancement for use of a computer or cell phone to induce the travel of a minor to engage in prohibited sexual conduct. There is no evidence that defendant induced or persuaded Jane to travel to California, and there is no evidence that there was a computer or cell phone used to induce the travel or to create sexually exploitative videos. Jane was living with the defendant in Illinois, where the age of consent was 17, and Jane was 17 years of age. She traveled with defendant because defendant was performing in California. Any sex acts or recording of sex acts were incident to the travel. Paragraph 187. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 4 or more participants in connection with the Racketeering Act 10. Count 1, Racketeering Act 11, forced labor. Jane Doe 5. This is all this damn Azriel. That girl, Paragraph 191. Defendant objects to an enhancement that alleges that defendant committed the offense of sexual exploitation of a child in connection with the forced labor count. The government alleged that defendant was guilty of forced labor because defendant forced Jane to participate in sex acts with men and other women. There is simply no evidence that those acts took place when Jane was under the age of 18. Defendant cannot be found to have committed sexual exploitation of a child when he allegedly, in quotes, forced Jane to participate in sex acts with third parties if she was not under the age of 18. Defendant further objects to an enhancement on the basis that the offense involved material that portrays sadistic and masochistic conduct on other depictions of violence. The government did not offer any videos into evidence that portrayed Jane's sex acts with third parties that show any chastisement or beatings or spankings. And Jane's testimony regarding her alleged sexual abuse with third parties, the basis for the forced labor count, did not include acts of violence. Defendant also objects to an enhancement for use of a computer or cell phone to induce the travel of a minor to engage in sexually explicit conduct. There is no evidence that defendant or persuaded Jane to travel to anywhere to participate in these group sex acts. The record suggests that these activities actually took place where defendant and Jane lived together. Paragraph 193. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the evidence does not reveal that the defendant was the organizer or leader or criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 11. Count 1, Racketeering Act 13, forced labor, Jane Doe 6. Paragraph 197. Defendant objects to a 2-point enhancement for brandishing a firearm. So Jane Doe 6 is Faith, guys. Faith's testimony established that defendant did not brandish a firearm. Although she noticed the weapon, she did not allege that defendant brandished it. Indeed, defendant never touched the gun or made any gestures toward using the gun. Faith described the defendant as being serious but not threatening. Paragraph 198. Defendant objects to any enhancement on the basis that defendant used force in connection with this act of oral sex. Faith did not testify that she objected to the act of oral sex. The record fails to reflect that force or threats of force were used in connection with this sex act. Even Faith admitted that her sexual relationship with defendant was voluntary, if unpleasant. Paragraph 200. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 13. Count 1, Racketeering Act 9, and counts 2, 3, 4, and 5, Mann Act, Jane Doe 5, paragraph 203. Defendant objects to the base offense level of 32, where the predicate sexual act of this Mann Act violation was not sexually exploitation of a child, but rather intentional exposure to an STD. Although the government did also charge an alternative theory that defendant transported Jane to California with the intent to violate California state law prohibiting sexual intercourse with a person under the age of 18, the verdict form did not specify that it found that defendant was guilty under this theory. Paragraph 204. Defendant objects to an enhancement based on the commission of a sexual act. Where the act is duplicative of the sexual conduct contemplated by sexual exploitation of a child and the base offense level. Paragraph 205. Defendant also objects to an enhancement for use of a computer or cell phone to induce the travel of a minor to engage in sexually explicit conduct. There is no evidence that defendant induced, persuaded Jane to travel to anywhere to participate in sex acts or sex acts that were recorded. And no evidence demonstrates that defendant used computers or cell phones for this purpose. Defendant and Jane lived together in Chicago at this time. They traveled together because they were in a relationship with one another. Paragraph 207. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 9. Count 1, Racketeering Act 12, and Count 6 and 7, Mann Act Jane Doe 6. Paragraph 210. Defendant objects to the base offense level of 18, where the record does not show the defendant used coercion against Faith to travel to New York for the purpose of exposing her to STD. The records show unequivocally that defendant asked Faith to travel to New York. She accepted. Faith herself does not contend otherwise. No coercion was used in connection with this trip whatsoever. Paragraph 212. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 12. Count 1, Racketeering Act 14, and Counts 8 and 9, Mann Act, Jane Doe 6. This is just awful. The crap that they put together to try to nail this man. This is just awful. Paragraph 215. Defendant objects to the base offense of 18 where the record does not show that defendant used coercion against Faith to travel to New York or to engage in any sex act with Faith while in New York. Faith testified to the opposite. Paragraph 217. Defendant objects to the 4-point enhancement on the basis that the evidence does not reveal that defendant was the organizer or leader of criminal activity that involved 5 or more participants in connection with Racketeering Act 12. Paragraphs 219 through 225. For the reason identified, defendant objects to the total offense of level 43. Part B. The defendant's criminal history. Paragraph 227. Defendant objects to probation's reliance on this alleged 1996 arrest for misdemeanor battery based on internet tabloid reports. Are you kidding me? Let me read this part again. Defendant objects to probation's reliance on this alleged 1996 arrest for misdemeanor battery based on internet tabloid reports. Wow. No official records exist of defendant's arrest or the disposition of the alleged arrest. The mere presence of the arrest on a criminal history report and internet tabloid reports does not offer sufficient reliability that the offense occurred and that defendant was convicted and or sentenced to a year of probation after allegedly pleading no contest to simple battery. Oh my God, Jennifer, they didn't expect you. They wouldn't have put all that crazy stuff in there. They did not expect you, girl. Paragraphs 232 through 244. Defendant objects on the basis that pending charges and any offenses for which defendant was acquitted are irrelevant to his sentencing in this case and impinged on the presumption of innocence. Part C. Offender characteristics. Paragraph 255. Defendant objects to the extent that probation seeks to paint Jocelyn Savage as a victim. Savage is engaged in a consensual relationship with defendant and is engaged to him. Defendant has been incarcerated for over 2 years, belying the suggestion that he has forced or induced her into a sexually abusive relationship that exists today. Part D. Sentencing options. Paragraph 288. Defendant objects to the total offense level of 43 and criminal history category 1 for the reasons identified above. Paragraph 305. Defendant objects on the basis that no enterprise existed and he did not profit from any racketeering activities associated with the non-existent enterprise. Wow, that's it, guys. That's some these people, man, well, we know it, but they manufactured this case. Oh my God. But I'm going to hold all that till we get together tomorrow during our jam session. And, if you guys want to talk about it, we can. If anyone wants a copy, please shoot me an email. You have my email address for this channel, and I'll be more than happy for you guys if you want to just read it for yourselves. But I just felt, since I was lucky enough to get a copy of that I would just go ahead and share the entire objection with you guys. Okay? So don't forget, I jam session tomorrow, 7 p.m. Central. Okay? Wow. All right, I'm not going to hold you because I'm about to get started, but I'm going to hold my feelings about this till we talk tomorrow. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.